Welcome back to the grind. In this video, we are going to talk about obtaining Cavalier status by completing one time through Chapter 1 of Act 6. So we're going to go one by one and point out the paths that I chose, talk a little bit about the bosses and the global nodes, but I will also be having individual videos on each of these maps. The first one we will go into is obviously the first map that you will face, and that is with Sabretooth as the boss. And I took this path here. Most of the champions were fairly simple to fight, and the boosts that they had were not very complicated. So it was not a very difficult path to take getting to the boss, and Sabretooth himself is not a terribly difficult champion, but he does have some pretty good regeneration, so that is something that you'll have to overcome. And if you're not used to his special attacks, then those can be challenging to evade as well, but they can be fairly simply evaded for the most part. Now, the global node in this map is no retreat. So the attacker, when the attacker dashes back, they will gain a degeneration timer for 1.2 seconds. And during that time, if you dash back again, you will have a degeneration debuff placed on you, which will deal 200% of the defender's attack as direct damage over 5 seconds. So you can dodge back if you want, but you cannot dodge back twice within a 1.2 second period. So you have to be careful about that. If you must, then it's not the end of the world. You don't lose all your health, but it is a pretty significant chunk of health. If you can't heal it back up, it can be pretty detrimental. Each of these fights has their own unique local buffs as well, so make sure to check those out so you know what you're dealing with. But I used mostly Blade and Stark Spider-Man to get through these fights, as well as Ghost Rider. Those are the ones I'm most comfortable with, and a lot of them are villains, so it was easy to do with Blade. And then for the boss, using primarily Stark Enhanced Spider-Man and Blade once again, I did take a couple attempts on this boss, and you can see the gameplay in another video that will be coming out, but I wanted to keep this short and summarize the whole Act 6 Chapter 1. So the main buff on Sabretooth is that you cannot reverse the heals, but you can remove the heal by using those types of spells. So that's pretty much it for this map. Now for the next map, the boss is Ultron, and Ultron is a bit tricky because of one of the buffs that he has, which applies shock to the attacker whenever he uses a special attack. Now, this either requires a shock immune champion, which I did not have initially, but thankfully I did pull Doom shortly after I started, which was awesome. You can check out that video on my channel as well. But whenever the defender or the attacker gains a buff, the defender gains an overclock charge. And then when he uses a special attack, it puts shock damage on the opponent, which is you, and that can be pretty deadly. So I actually use Blade a lot more with that villain status on Ultron. Blade actually was very effective, and he did the majority of my damage. So I did use a couple revives on this boss, but overall it wasn't terrible. Blade actually came through pretty good for me. And as far as the path that I chose, I went with the science one, partly because they are fairly simple champions. The buffs on them were not too difficult, and there was science, so Blade also was very reliable for me. Now, the global node essentially means you need to use a special attack every 15 hits. So whenever you use a special attack, it resets that 15 combo charges, and before it gets to 0, you need to use another special attack. So you can delay as long as possible, so you can slowly build up to a special 2, but for the majority of the fights, you'll be using the special ones on these fights. And the other tricky part is the Sentinel here has Arc Overload and Biohazard, so you preferably need a bleed immune champion that does a lot of damage or heal blocks or nullifies. Now, I use Ghost Rider a lot for this one, but also Blade was useful. I think I died partway through with Ghost Rider and finished it off with Blade actually a lot easier. So Blade is really coming through for me as an old player without a lot of the new champions, allowing me to make some significant progress still with some older champions. And that's pretty much it for this map. Now for the third one, Ghost is the boss, and the little mini boss beforehand is Thing. Thing was actually a little bit new to me because, coming back, I hadn't learned this one, but I practiced a little bit and got the hang of it. Now the global node here is while you're close to the defender, you gain weakness charges every 3 seconds, or weakness debuffs, I should say, and So when you're playing a close range champion and you're very aggressive, you do need to take breaks to pause and go back. A lot of champions that I use, again, Blade and Stark, they naturally create distance throughout the fight, so it helps to keep the charges minimal. So I took this path here, a lot of fairly old champions that I'm familiar with fighting, and so I didn't have too much difficulty getting to the boss there. When I got to Thing, I had brought a bleed champion, which was Black Panther, but he wasn't very high rank. It didn't really do the thing for me, but Blade came through. Every time you parry, you get rid of 3 of those charges, so very easy to manage Thing with Blade. And then Ghost is fairly simple. The special attacks do not have range to them really, so basically just needing to get the hang of fighting Ghost's mechanics, and I went in with Ghost Rider to test things out and pretty much finished the whole fight. I died by a brief mistake. I lost at like 5% left. So the one thing to keep in mind is there is limber on here, so you can't parry too many times in a row. So you will need to practice baiting out heavies, specials, and intercepting. The next map has Loki as the boss, which is a fairly simple boss to beat. Not too much difficulty there. Again, a villain, so Blade came in very handy for me. I didn't take the easiest path here. I actually went down because I wanted a little bit more unique run on this one. Each boss or each of these fights had a different buff, and they were mostly pretty easy to do with Blade. And the thing with Rhino here is Aspect of War, which eventually makes him stun immune and more unstoppable, so a little bit more difficulty there, but again with Blade not too difficult. Same thing for Void, except he's stun immune, but Blade can apply the bleed still, which was very handy. And then I think for Wasp, I think that's Wasp, this is a newer one for me, but the heavy attacks got a 500% boost, so I actually used just spammed heavies, parried and heavy, parry and heavy, and that really made this fight pretty easy. Not a whole lot of rage or energy built up, so not too many special attacks to deal with. So that was a pretty simple one to do as well. And then the last fight was Blade. Not too much trouble managing that fight either. And the buffs on Blade included Energizer, which means he got his power built up very quickly. So someone like Doom is awesome for this fight. And then the global node on this map was close encounters. So if you're close to the enemy, you get 1% rage per sec or health per second, and if you're far away, you lose 3% per second. So fighting aggressive with close combat champions was useful. Then people like Blade and Stark Spider-Man actually create distance, so I did take some damage intermittently there. But once you get the hang of it, it's not too hard to manage overall, so fairly easy there as well. And then the last one before Loki is MODOK, which has a limber, so you gotta be careful there, making sure you can intercept and bait stuff out. And then Loki, not too bad, has Force of Will, and so you reduces your ability accuracy reduction and increases buff duration and limber on him as well, and then enhanced special 1, so it's unblockable. Oh, and part of the reason I chose that path that I did was there was these 3000 tier 2 alpha catalysts on the path that I came down, so that was some incentive there. And that's it for this map. And now for the Crossbones map. This one is very challenging because of the buffs on Crossbones. He's a pretty beefed up tanky boss because he has Biohazard and Vigor. So he heals up a lot and you take bleed damage when you attack him. And so obviously the best way of doing this would be having a bleed immune champion that can either reverse or prevent heals. However, I don't really have a lot of options as far as my 5-star champions, so I pretty much ended up using Blade and Ghost Rider to do the majority of my damage. Blade actually did pretty good because Crossbones is a villain, so he did quite a bit of damage, and Ghost Rider came through quite a bit for me as well because he was able to nullify the heal. So I did get quite a bit more time before quitting and exiting the fight to avoid the heals on this boss. And I'll show you some gameplay in another video. This is one of the fights that I recorded pretty much all the attacks, I believe, so not the greatest gameplay, but something so you can see that even free to play with limited roster, you can still get through without spending too much on this boss. Now, the global node for this one was one of the most annoying in my opinion, and that was that you only earned power by getting the enemy across a power bar threshold. And then if the enemy used a special before you used your power, then you would lose however much power that enemy used. So if they use a special 2, you will use up to 2 bars of power. But this actually made things pretty easy with Stark Spider-Man on most of the other fights that did not have stun immune, because it allowed me to get them across 1 bar of power, and then I would get 1 bar of power so I could stun them, and then do another combo and get them across the 2nd bar of power to stun them again, and then again get them to 3 full bars of power, stun them 1 more time, and then power drain them. And at that point, the fight was already 2/3 to 3/4 of the way over, so not very difficult running the path that I chose. So the path that I chose was the far left one here, fairly simple. The fights are not difficult, especially with the champions that I had available, mostly using Blade and Stark Spider-Man. However, you could use a number of different champions for these fights. They're not too difficult. The buffs are not too complicated either. And finally, the last map with the Sentinel boss. This one wasn't too challenging, but I first tried to go up the center path, and that didn't really work for me. And the global node here is Hurt Locker, so you can basically only, you can't use 2 of the same specials in a row. Otherwise, you'll take a lot of damage unless you're able to quickly land a heavy attack within 5 seconds after using your special, and I did not want to risk it. So I had trouble dealing enough damage to Havoc quick enough, and I had limited options for my champions, and so the only ones that mainly would power drain was Havoc, and because I couldn't use special 1 over and over again, I was not able to succeed in getting rid of those plasma charges. So instead, I chose this bottom left path, which was not too difficult actually, except for Hulkbuster I struggled with because he is a bit new to me with all the changes. He's a pretty tough champion. So the first 2 fights, they have sharpened claws, so if you take a block, then you get a bleed, and so I used Ghost Rider for the first 2. I died on the second one, and Blade actually, because he's a villain, Blade actually did pretty good, was able to limit the number of bleeds I took, and I was able to heal back the health when I did take some damage from it. The main thing is a lot of these guys have a lot of armor up, and you cannot armor break on these on this path here, so that is a little bit of a challenge. But with Blade and Stark Spider-Man and Doom, actually, I was able to clear this path pretty easily, except for Hulkbuster. Once again, I did use a couple revives on him. And then this last fight here, Red Skull has the Energizer 1, so easily gained energy, which made him easy to capitalize on with Doom. And so that was pretty much this path. And then you teleport over to Sentinel, who isn't too bad overall. He has a bunch of specific class debuffs, and then he is stun immune and has Plagued Mind, so he drains your power or your energy every 20 seconds. So that is probably one of the most difficult parts of this fight, because you got to be able to get your specials off quick enough. So I used a couple 100 to 300 units on revives for this match, and I actually used team revives, so I used a lot of my champions testing different things out. I think Blade was the most useful for me once again on this fight as well, and I'll be sharing that gameplay in another video if you're interested in seeing the whole fight and how many times I died and revived using a bunch of old champions without any new ones and very limited cost. This whole clearing to get Cavalier took me under 1,000 units. So definitely not too bad, and I definitely think it was worth it to get this as quick as possible to help speed up my progression back in the game. So once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.